I'm going to talk about, I was asked to talk about equity in Australian universities, and I'm building on several projects that I've done with a variety of my colleagues, of course, so it's not just my own work there. And I wanted to highlight the fragmentation of employment in Australian universities. So I'm going to go quickly through some of the data and come to a couple of other points. So I thought, well, what's happening? Well, more women than men work in Australian universities. More men than women are in senior positions in Australian universities. Yet Australia has over 40 years of gender equity legislation. And universities are the highest performing industry under this legislation because they have a league table of that. Yet we still have these issues around equity in employment. So on the one hand, universities in Australia are the high performers in terms of applying the gender equity legislation. But on the other hand, universities have the second highest proportion of insecure staff of all industries in Australia, second only to retail sales. So what does this mean for gender equity, and why do we have to keep reinventing, issues? Why has it not become embedded, a lot of these practices? So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about the structure of employment in universities fairly quickly, a little bit about the culture from other research, and a little bit about our recent project, which is about the impact of 2020 and 2021. Just a really brief word about equity legislation in Australia. There are two types of legislation. One is anti-discrimination legislation, which forbids discrimination and is focused on the level of individual complaint. And the other one, introduced in the 1980s, is the production of plans to achieve equality of opportunity for specified groups. It includes, it's targeted at women, but other groups such as non-English speaking background people with disability can be included. And it's at the organisational level. So the organisation is required to look at what's happening and set targets, etc. But there are minimal sanctions for not complying. So the little bit about the structure of employment, you'll note that some of these dates are a little bit earlier. It's quite difficult to get comprehensive data, so I'm basing some of this on earlier research where we collected and manipulated a huge body of data. But the first thing about the structure of employment in Australian universities is that a large proportion are on fixed term contracts. So in terms of the academic staff, just over half 10 years ago had continuing or permanent contracts, while just under half were on we're on other forms of contract. And about 25% of our professional staff are on contract. And in these, you can notice that, for instance, in the general and professional staff, more women are on contract than men. So that's a huge part. The other part of the insecurity in Australian universities relates to the teaching workforce. And we call them casual or sessional staff. They're essentially hourly paid, often employed just for the one term or one semester, but essentially hourly paid. And you can see here, and this is from 2010, it's very hard to get this data, but it has not improved, the situation has not improved, in fact it's worsened, that you have a larger number of people on these hourly paid contracts doing the teaching in universities than you do on those full-time and part-time staff on permanent employment. So there's a huge workforce there waiting in the wings, a lot of them, for permanent work. And I'd just like to highlight the characteristics of employment of the research staff in universities. So this was from our survey in 2010. I can tell you absolutely nothing has changed, but this allowed the collection of detailed data. So then 84% of research staff, which was 2,098 people from our survey, were on fixed term contracts, usually no longer than 3 years, often 1 year or 2 years. Of the postdocs, virtually all of them were on fixed term contracts. And the majority of the sector had worked in the sector for a while. Only 1/3 had worked for less than 3 years. And so what happens is people go from one contract to the next contract to the next contract, often for a lifetime of work as research staff across mainly the sciences. And you can see that the level of appointment is different for the research-only staff and the research and teaching academics. So not only are the research staff more likely to be on contract and secure, they're more likely to be at very low levels and have virtually no chance of rising up through the ranks. So in Australia, I've got levels A to E there, and level A is tutor, B is lecturer, C senior lecturer, D associate professor, and E full professor. So we follow this British model of appointment of professors. So the huge number of research staff are appointed at level A and level B, and you can see they hardly ever get anywhere else. Whereas there's a bit more of a trajectory for those who are in research and teaching appointments. And just one quick word on full and part-time. More women than men, of course, work part-time. Some of that part-time, though, is full-time work. And there is a bit of a good news story from research we did for our full-time professional staff, was that if they move from full-time work to part-time work, still on a permanent contract, and back again, then in the long term, when we traced their careers, there was no penalty for doing that. So you can have good quality part-time work in there. And one other quick word about our professional staff that once again goes from under level 4 to level 10 plus. So 4 is lower, 10 is higher. You can see once again that women predominate in the lower levels, just like they did for academic staff. But of course, men predominate in the senior positions. So both for academic and professional staff, there's a similar pattern when you look at seniority. And women professors, this is probably a busy slide here, but in 2019, level E professor, 35% of the professors are women. And you can see if you look at this side, the pale blue is the full professors, and it's been going up by about 1% about a year, a year, very, very slowly trajectory, although it is trending upwards. So what we posit about this, and this is a problem for gender equity, is that you have a high level of insecurity and slightly more women than men in that category. You have marginalisation in the research positions because they really have no career path whatsoever. And now, particularly since last year, more and more teaching only positions are being appointed. So we could have the same position of them not having the same career paths as well. And more women are definitely appointed in teaching only positions than men. And we have we call it sort of funneling, I suppose, but the career paths vertically narrow for women. Women are less in senior positions. But as we've noted, when you get to academic staff, each discipline area is really its own labour market. So we actually have different patterns in different disciplinary areas. To add to that structural area, which I'm really, really passionate about, if you haven't got a structure that will allow people to enter and get permanent jobs and move through them, then no amount of other gender equity policies is going to solve your problems. So there's significant ones in that structural area. And I suppose I should go back to a point there, really. These remain, despite our reports, many reports that detail these issues, which are critically important for women's employment, changes don't happen. So still today, excuse me, my cat's just jumped up on the computer. Even today, the research staff are still 80% plus on contracts in this country. And the majority of them have PhDs, etc. The other point, and I've done research with my colleague Mahan Pour Hossan Zaideh, a lot of that there, is we've looked at the culture and characteristics of senior positions in universities, both professional and academic. And excuse me, and the some of the points that come out there are the characteristics excuse me. Apologies. The characteristics of the jobs. And it's no surprise to find no surprise to find that it's a long hours culture. I mean, there's a lot of literature written about that. One quote from one male executive was, "It's difficult to define when you're working and when you're not working." I guess I would say typically 60, maybe 70 hours a week might be typical. No surprise there. The other things that we uncovered that were regarded as essential for moving into senior positions were things like geographical and organisational mobility. And we know from other work that women move less than men do for their jobs. Choosing career over family was critically important, and one man said, well, you've got a partner who looks after the kids and you can indulge in your career. And we obviously know the gendered effects there. And an unbroken career path. So in a way, these are nothing new. We put together a few other things. But if you continually are looking at senior positions where these are the characteristics that define those senior positions, and the people who actually attain them have this model, are employing other people doing it, then you're clearly going to have significant gendered effects on getting into senior management. And in the work with we developed a model of the ideal executive, developing, for those of you who are familiar with Joan Acker's ideal worker. So the characteristics that were there are highly gendered in terms of the literature and the experiences of women and the statistics we know. So if you've got this model that you're using for recruitment into senior positions, then your outcome is going to be a gendered outcome. And just one other small thing about this research. Of course, the universities in Australia, they're up there, as I said, with their gender equity plans. They've probably got of any industry, they've probably got the best type of flexible work arrangements in the country. And, you know, as I said, permanent part-time work, etc. But the equity arrangements only apply to those who are permanent staff. So immediately we have a huge workforce in the universities who actually are not covered by their equity policies, or are largely not covered by their equity policies, or their equity, their policies and programs like flexible work, etc. And of course, this is not something new either, but our research reinforced the fact that women moving into senior positions do not choose to use flexible work arrangements because they're seen as, not going to enhance their career at all. And I've got a couple of quotes there. I think it's where it's challenging for academic women in particular is that you do not get promoted on getting research grants and publications, is that you do get promoted on getting research grants and doing publications. So if you take periods of time off for parental leave, nobody else is getting you the research grants or doing the publications. So you get these blocks in your career, and it's very difficult even to make up that time again. None of the male managers we've interviewed made any use of flexible work arrangements. Most reported that they had an understanding wife who took care of their family while they were busy with career progression. So a typical quote was, "I have someone at home who supports me and my family." But certainly, I think if a person who has to do a leadership role didn't have that support, then the responsibility of caring for family would really be a challenge. And also in some of the quotes from some of the male managers, women were seen as, still, would you believe, being a liability because of their caring commitments or their potential caring commitments. So that's clearly, it was quite surprising to find that in our research, actually, that in the enlightened universities with all its policies, people would still talk about that. Now, to finish off, we did a big survey led by my colleague David Peets and many other people. We did a big survey of university staff in Canada and Australia last year, and we're just going through the results now. And what's happened in 2020 and 2021 to universities? First of all, the official estimate says that 18,000 permanent staff have lost their job. But we don't know how many contract and casual staff have lost their jobs, because if it's come to the end of a contract, someone may not have been re-employed, even though they normally would have had an expectation of that. So there's been huge job losses in Australia. There's been consequent, we know, big increases in workload, particularly around teaching for the remaining staff. So there's a big concern at the moment about the health of the remaining staff because of their hours and extra hours and stress. Of course, the majority of people impacted by home childcare and homeschooling were women. That's quite obvious from our survey, and that's really, we all knew that anyway. And I've given one quote from our open-ended questions there. It's a typical quote from women. The endless interruptions while trying to work, homeschooling children while teaching online classes was very stressful, and I felt like I couldn't do a very good job of either. I didn't have my own quiet or comfortable space to work during semester one, but I have now set up a desk in my bedroom, So there were lots of inequalities, or new level of inequalities, that I'll mention in a minute, that I think were added last year. The impact on research, we've looked at that in our data. Around 80% in both Australia and Canada of academics reported a deterioration in their ability to collect data. 44% female, 34% male agreed that there are unrealistic expectations in me of terms of research outcomes, and likewise with the ability to meet the university's likely research expectations. So that's just one of the impacts that we're looking at in terms of the academic staff. And there is a bit of a gender difference that's significant in those answers to the research. Oh, and well, I could make one of the things that in going through all of this, working from home compulsorily, which happened, introduces a whole range of other inequalities. So people personally may not be suited to it, they may be depressed, they may not have a home situation, either personal or space-wise, that lends them to being able to do it. So it introduces another level of inequality, and it has a gendered face, certainly around the work and homeschooling issue. So conclusions, it's a fragmented labour market. Academics work in different types of universities under different contracts and different roles. There are numerous labour markets by discipline and effectively little movement between these different disciplines.
So I wanted to start with my one popular tweet that I ever made, which was in April of last year, just as the pandemic was starting to pick up in the US. And what I wrote was, the economy isn't closed, people. The economic activities that we're doing, childcare, cooking, cleaning, etc., just aren't considered valuable by most economists. At the time in the US, we were hearing all kinds of politicians and media people saying, like, the economy is closed, how are we going to open the economy, as if we were talking about something that was primarily an economic crisis. So, this is my response to that, because there is lots of economic activity that's happening. This raises the question of why, though, those activities aren't considered valuable by most economists, at least most of the time. And so the reasons for this are, this is considered women's work, it's done in the household, and pretty key in that is that it's usually unpaid work. It's also thought of typically as unskilled work, although that's certainly debatable. But in any case, the work is characterized by being low status. And at the same time, this tweet got a relative lot of attention. So it seemed like it resonated somehow for people in, we were probably even less than a month in at that point to there being any kind of shutdowns in the US. I think one of the reasons that this got some attention was because this kind of work became more visible to people. And that's partly just a function of people being in their households. I think that a lot of people began to recognize this, from Zoom meetings and having windows into other people's lives and into their own and being exposed to it. At the same time, one of the things that happened that's salient here is that a more diverse population started doing this work. And so I'll show you in a minute that it increased more for women, but it increased for men also. And the other thing is just simply that the amount of it increased, and that increased as there were school shutdowns, shutdown of long-term care facilities, and obviously people were sick as well. So this is all here for COVID context. The question is really, what about non-COVID periods? Like, this is work that's still happening. What's going on with perceptions of this work while it's happening, but is not quite so visible? So I want to make an argument here that obviously this work is happening all the time, but moreover, sort of zooming out from that, that there's actually no paid work that can happen in the economy, what economists will typically talk about as the economy. There's no paid work without the unpaid work that reproduces people to go and do that work, which is to say there's no production without reproduction. And that's true both on an intergenerational basis and on a day-to-day basis. So one of the questions that I always like to start with is, where does the labor supply come from? And this is, sometimes an interesting question because people, you can think about this historically and say, well, into different modes of production, we have the European stylized story of a movement from feudalism to capitalism. In reality, we know that different modes of production coexist, but in each of them, there's a labor supply, right? And so that labor supply has to come from somewhere. And the answer of where that comes from is women and women's work. So women and women's work are at the center of the existence of the thing that we call the economy to begin with. So we have women doing intergenerational reproduction and the work of socializing children and things like that, which expands into women's work but isn't done strictly by women, but is still considered women's work nonetheless. The SR is there to indicate social reproduction, is another term for that. So we have women and women's work that reproduces communities and families, and those are what make up society and are participants in the economy, right? So the whole understanding of the economy shouldn't be just about a narrow portion of work that's productive labor. It really needs to be about a much larger view. And so economists' focus on this much narrower thing of production is a real problem. Right? The focus on paid work, focus on production, or framing that divides paid and unpaid work. Right? What those framings do, or what that focus will do, is provide an interpretation of the economy that people think of as perhaps incomplete. And they'll say, okay, well, there is all this other stuff, but the real stuff, the real economics is over here in this thing that we're already studying. But the reality of that actually is that that's not just an incomplete understanding of the economy, it's an incorrect understanding of the economy. Because the economy requires a labor supply, and that labor supply comes from this other non-economic, in terms of what most economists think is economic activity, world. Right? But the world that they study depends on the existence of this world. So I'm going to run through a little bit of data and then the mechanisms and then a little bit more on the impacts. So they're setting the scene for why women's work is important, fundamentally important for the economy. Basically, from this table chart figure, I just wanted to show two things, which are basically that at the bottom we have reported cases being higher for women, relatively higher than they are for men. At the top, you see places where cases are relatively higher for men than they are for women. This is reported cases, so the quality of that data is already questionable. But in general, it seems like the physiological impacts of COVID in terms of mortality and morbidity are disproportionately shouldered by men. So that's just a distribution there. There were lots of countries for this, which is one of the reasons it was useful, and India is in there also. At the same time, if you ask people about the impacts on their physical health, and this is from a set of Asian countries, about 20 Asian countries, women report physical health impacts, negative physical health impacts. About 1 in 4 women report those, and about 1 in 5 men. And if you look at mental health impacts, we have about 2/3 of women and over half of men. So in aggregate on that, clearly the mental health impacts of this are extremely damaging. The physical health impacts of it, we know, are also damaging. And some of those are weighing more heavily on women, even though men are more likely to get sick and more likely to die from COVID. So there's this physiological story about it, but then there are these uneven social and economic effects. The uneven is in quotes there because the unevenness is distributed along hierarchies of things like race and gender and caste and class and disability status and things like that. So some of those effects that are things that are measurable are things like employment in different sector, unemployment rates, changes in employment, income, the workload for unpaid work, and who drops out of the labor force and why. Right? So we'll see that women are disproportionately concentrated in sectors of essential work, in paid work, and that's in work typically that sustains human life or is related to health. The same is true of unpaid work, that work is also essential. So when you have this decrease in employment, right, or rises in unemployment for women, at the same time we saw massive increases in the workload in the household, what that did was, for women, pull people out of the labor force completely. So one of the questions of looking at this is, okay, if the physiological impacts are disproportionately on men, and part of that comes from social determinants of health, like smoking, which is disproportionately high among men relative to women, why are there these uneven social effects, and why are their patterns so predictable? And so one of the first answers to this is that it's not COVID, right? COVID itself doesn't produce these patterns. These patterns come from the way that work is organized. At a global level, actually that's wrong, sorry, my mistake. This was UN Women and that one is ILO, so this may actually include more countries then. But this is global data for all the countries that were available. So workplace closures, household work meant that women were more likely to leave the labor force because of it, which means that women are less likely then to go back and claim jobs that they had. So in terms of the impacts on women, they lost more jobs, but they were already less well or securely employed to begin with. They lost more income, but they were also lower income to begin with. They did more unpaid work, but they already did more unpaid work, and they were more likely to drop out of the labor force because of that work. And to add to that now, women may have to support more people on fewer incomes once the pandemic finally ends in, a number of years potentially. So the impacts on women were obviously significant. The impacts on men were too. In each case, though, the impacts were disproportionately worse for women, and women started in already a worse position. So in terms of thinking about implications and opportunities, thinking about whether organizations are always hierarchical, in class terms and capitalism, most of the time that's going to be true. There's an owner of capital, there's owners of labor, but there are no reasons that hierarchies within organizations need to be organized along the lines of other social hierarchies. Right? There's no necessary thing that produces that outcome. So in thinking about diversity, I would say that the revelatory role of COVID was to exacerbate existing problems primarily. And that means that those problems have become increasingly visible, right? So we're able to see them now, and firms should be thinking seriously about how to plan for diverse workplaces in the future, because the issues that we have now were issues prior to COVID and will remain issues afterwards unless there's some radical reformation of gender norms, which I don't think anyone expects. So I would encourage firms, especially academic institutions as well, to not just settle at being able to see these things, but interrogating them, thinking carefully about them, and what kinds of policies could be in place to increase diversity, and then to move past just increasing diversity to working for inclusion, right? So, and on the inclusion point, I would say, yes, more inclusion of women, that would be good. But we really need to think in terms of the kinds of work that women do. It would also be good to have diversity in unpaid work. But one of the things that really needs to happen is valuing women's work as legitimate work, as valuable work, as work that contributes to society. And from a business side on that, this is not just acknowledging that the work happens, but acknowledging that we individually and collectively as firms, as families, as communities benefit from that work that is unpaid. So that work is legitimate and valuable and contributory. And there's no greater evidence than this point, that there's no production, there's no labor supply, there's no the economy without that work. So I'll stop there and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. I think it's a wonderful presentation.
So first, I would like to talk about my research identity. Now, what kind of research I do and which areas or which domains do this research span. Now, I'm very much interested in the intersection of workplace diversity and strategic HRM, especially at both the micro level as well as the macro level. At micro level, I do research on employee stigmas, where a couple of projects on that area relates to stigmatized family identity and allies to stigmatized employees. Now, the stigmatized family identity is something which very recently came out at the Human Relations, and that's one of the papers I'm briefly going to discuss today. The second thing is allies to stigmatized employees. Now, this is actually multiple projects involved in this area, and it also involves my dissertation work as well, where we examine the role of allies in terms of providing support to employees with stigmas in the workplace, what kind of risks they might encounter in enacting this role, what kind of outcomes that might lead to from enacting this role. So this is a huge project which I've been involved for the last 4 or 5 years, and we have collected data from multiple sources and plan to send to a journal very soon. At leader diversity level, that's at the macro level, I'm more interested in women on boards and top management teams. And that's when I have some interesting projects which I'm working on. The first one which you can see is Women on Boards and Shareholder Dissent. Now, this is again a paper which recently came out at OxScience. And this is also, I'm going to briefly talk about specialist relevance in the pandemic or the post-pandemic. Then there is another paper which we are working on. We are planning to submit to a journal very soon. And that's something which I would like to get feedback from you because it's a work in progress. Then there are a couple of other papers where I look into CEO life events and how it impacts their value changes and how it impacts the strategic choices, as well as role of exogenous social shocks and how it impacts shareholder activism, pushing firms to take more diversity and inclusion initiatives. Now, without much ado, I'll start with the first paper. Now, this paper is a conceptual piece which came out in Human Relations, and where we introduced the new concept of a stigmatized family identity. Now, stigma research has been there in place for almost 5 to 6 decades, starting with Goffman, who introduced the concept of stigma. But most of the research on stigma actually focuses on different kinds of stigma, such as race, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, chronic illnesses, etc. What we were more interested in understanding, like individuals who have this stigma or the social stigmatized identity, what kind of family structures do they have, and if that family structure adds to this further stigma or not. And that's where we introduce this concept of stigmatized family identity, where we look into the intersection of having a stigmatized social identity as well as a non-traditional family structure. So for example, stigmatized family identity can take place in different forms. For example, employees with same-sex partner households, transgender single-parent employees, minority race single-parent employees, or employees from minority race multi-generational households. So as you can see, it's an intersection between the stigmatized identity as well as the non-traditional family structure. For example, in case of same-sex partner households, we have individuals who do not identify as heterosexual, as well as they're involved or they're part of same-sex partner households. Similarly, somebody who has a transgender identity, as well as a single parent, or somebody with a minority race, especially in the US, like African American or Asian or Hispanic, as well as they are single parents. So that's something which is, again, a non-traditional family structure. And then there can be employees with minority race at the same time having multi-generational households, which has been found a lot in Indian as well as Asian households, where people of multiple generations living together in the same household, which might increase the challenges of employees in some cases. So we were more interested in understanding the different kinds of challenges which such employees with such unique identities experience, and how can those challenges can be met by providing flexibility idiosyncratic deals, because the one-size-fits-all organizational HR practices may not be able to provide the kind of support which such employees need. And that's where idiosyncratic deals negotiated between the employee and the manager can be of use in terms of mitigating some of these unconventional challenges or unconventional needs. We are also more interested in looking from the lens of social privilege, because that's something which is often ignored, that employees with such kind of stigmatized identities may not have the privilege to even understand the kind of challenges they're experiencing and seek support from the workplace to overcome those challenges. Because of the traditionally marginalized identities, they may have become accustomed to it and may not be willing to accept that they also can get different resources to mitigate these challenges from arising from their work-family domains. Now, this is the framework which we have conceptualized, and I don't want to go into much details because it's a very big framework. But as you can see, we look into the work-family outcomes of stigmatized family identity employees and how it shapes different job attitudes as well as job performance. And then we look at different contextual factors, look at individual, team, as well as organizational level, which can shape stigmatized family identity employees seeking of flexibility ideals. And it depends on a number of factors as to what extent the employee is willing to disclose the stigmatized identity, to what extent the teams and the leaders in which they are part of are supportive, and to what extent do organizations believe in creating a fair workplace for every employee, regardless of their stigmatized identity. So this is something which came out, and we're happy to share the paper after the seminar. The second paper and the third paper look into women on boards. Now, this is something where I'm more interested in integrating micro perspectives with macro data. Now, the first paper which I'm going to talk about is Women on Boards and Shareholder Dissent. Now, the interesting thing about this paper is that there's a lot of research on women on boards and what firms are doing in terms of improving the percentage of women on corporate boards. But very little understanding exists about how do shareholders perceive women on boards. And that's where we were more interested in exploring the concept of shareholder dissent. So what happens is that at every annual year elections, we have the board directors who are nominated by the firm, and the shareholders get to vote whether they want that person or do not want that person as a director for the next financial year. So actually, even if the firms want to have more gender diversity in corporate boards, the ultimate decision-making power lies on the hands of the shareholders, because they are the ones who are going to vote for or vote against the directors. And that's where we looked into the female director nominees and saw like how the shareholder voting patterns changes based on different circumstances or different contextual factors. And what we found, I'll briefly show you the figure. What we found is that in general, if there is a female director nominee, which has been selected by the board, shareholders are more likely to approve that female director nominee and select them as the incumbent female director, because there is a lot of pressure from social norms, from regulatory norms to have more gender diversity on boards. And then there is also research showing that women bring value to corporate boards. So it's not just doing the socially responsible thing, but at the same time, there is the financial value, or there is the tangible value which women bring on boards, which actually is reflected when it comes to shareholders voting for female directors. Now, this relationship becomes stronger when there is already a fewer representation of females in the board. So if a board has, say, 1 or 2 female directors, shareholders will be more likely to appoint more female directors in that board. However, this coin flips when shareholders experience a threat to their short-term value maximization. And that's where we explore different factors at the firm level as well as at the director level to see what are these different factors which impact or which switch the shareholder decision-making and increase the dissent against female director nominees. So we look at the different factors such as firm underperformance, or if the firm is engaged in any kind of media controversies. And at the director level, we look into director board attendance as well as director non-attendance. And what we see is that when it comes to firms performing badly or firms embroiled in media controversies, shareholders punish female directors at a much higher rate than male directors. Similarly, when it comes to board attendance problems, so if it's a male director and a female director, both are missing board meetings, then the female director is penalized more compared to the male director because of social stereotypes of women being not able to handle challenging responsibilities as a director, or not able to give full time when it comes to managing different roles at that leadership level. So in general, while shareholders are supportive of female directors, but this support sort of vanishes when the firm is embroiled in some kind of a crisis situation, or there are some factors related to the director itself. And that's where I would like to highlight its impact, especially post-pandemic, is that given the economic crisis looming right now in different countries and firms not doing financially well, it really poses a question like, in future shareholder meetings, will we see more or we'll see less female directors nominees getting appointed as female directors or not? And that's where the question lies, like all this work done on increasing gender diversity in boards, will it really push back that cause? Will it really push back the importance of having more women on boards or women in top management teams? At the same time, this paper also makes a very important cause of like looking into shareholder voting patterns and shift the focus from firms to shareholders to understand what really goes on in their minds when it comes to voting for or against female directors or male directors, to better understand, like, even if firms really want to bring gender diversity in corporate boards, the shareholders are willing to bring them or not. And at the same time, to what extent are shareholders really willing to diversify boards? Is it through all circumstances, or is it only when they think that it will benefit their short-term value maximization? And carrying forward this research is the third paper, which is the work in progress, and we plan to submit to a journal soon. And in this paper, we are sort of trying to build a more, more tangible way, or different kind of a tangible way in which women on boards bring value to the firms to further address the shareholder concerns, whether the value maximization is happening or not. Now, motivation for this paper were multiple. Especially if you have read upper echelons theory, it talks a lot about leaders' experiences, values, and personalities as some of the important factors which drive the strategic choices. Now, values and personalities have been studied extensively, especially from the point of view of regulatory focus or Big Five, or even in terms of values like stakeholder values, to what extent the leaders are value stakeholders versus shareholder values. But very little understanding exists about leader experiences. And that's where we believe that diversity can really create this kind of unique experiences which leaders bring into the top management team or to the boards. And that's how firms can benefit from that. So that was one of the main reasons to further expand upper echelons theory and understand from the female directors' experiences, as well as study the impact of upper echelons leadership on digital stakeholders, especially employees and customers, which are often ignored. So we are more interested in understanding the case of employees, like what kind of impact do members in the upper echelons or the corporate boards and top management teams have on employees. We see a lot of outcomes related to firm as a whole in terms of improving the firm's financial performance or improving the firm's market value in the industry. But what kind of values do these leaders bring when it comes to inside the organization or to the employees? And lastly, to link the literature on upper echelons theory with firm efficiency. Now, firm efficiency is a sort of an established or studied construct in accounting and finance, but very few research covers that in management. And most of the outcomes when it comes to upper echelons always focus on firm financial performance or R&D activity or different kind of shareholder returns and marketing returns, etc. So that's why we wanted to explore a different kind of firm outcome and see how can female board directors can contribute to that firm outcome. So in this framework, what we are looking into is that now female directors have some unique experiences when they navigate the institutional barriers in the workplace, what we call the glass ceiling. And those unique experiences shape their motivation to address those barriers. Something like which you have experienced or which you have encountered when you rise in the upward career mobility, that makes you more aware of some of the challenges which employees face. And that's where female directors use these experiences to work towards employees or mitigate some of the challenges towards these employees. Now, especially in terms of female directors, they encounter this glass ceiling where they are not provided sufficient training and development. They're not provided with sufficient mentoring, feedback, or even they are like fall under biases or stereotypes that women are really not made for leadership roles. And therefore, they are not given the necessary support and resources which are needed in order for their career progression. And these experiences are the ones which shape their perspectives when they are appointed into the corporate boards, because they know the challenges which one encounters in order to rise to the leadership. And that's where they can advocate for implementation of more human capital development policies, which can help employees overcome these challenges and make the upward career mobility more smoother for them. So we expect a relationship between women on boards and the extent of human capital development policies implemented by the organization. But at the same time, we believe that it's a relationship of diminishing returns, which means that although women bring these unique experiences, which can lead to more implementation of human capital development policies, but then as more and more women join the board, there might be a duplicity of experiences and perspectives. And that's where women may not be willing to share these experiences because of the fact that there are the women as well who had these experiences and challenges. So as a result, what happens is that these experiences or these perspectives are never brought into the board decision making or board discussions because of lack of novelty in terms of experiences and perspectives. So what we believe is that while there's a linear relationship in the beginning, the curve becomes flatter as the percentage of women on boards increases, and in terms of impacting the human capital development policies implementation. We also believe that there's a linear relationship between human capital development policies and firm efficiency, because the more such policies are implemented in the workplace, the more it will be bringing a change in a positive direction in terms of employee job attitudes and behaviors. And that will improve the productivity in the organization, contributing to the firm efficiency. Now, briefly covering the results, I would like to point some important findings from this study. So we found support for the hypothesis. So we did find like as you can see in the curve, that as female board representation increases, human capital development policies in those organizations also increases. But then the curve flattens after a certain point. And we found that point to be at 26%. So which means that when firms have at least 26% females on their corporate boards, after that, there is not much improvement or increase in terms of human capital development policies implementation. So that's where the curve becomes stagnant or the curve becomes flat. We also find a relationship between human capital development and firm policies and firm efficiency. But what we find is that it's creating a partial mediation, which means human capital development policies is one of the paths which link women on boards and firm efficiency. So that's also an interesting finding, because it's not just the only path. There can be other ways or other paths which can link the IB and the DB. And that's where there's a lot of opportunities or potential for future research. Now, this study, along with the other studies which I briefly mentioned, It I think it raises a lot of questions in terms of what will be the shifting priorities for organizations post-pandemic. The first thing is based on the stigmatized family identity. It's a conceptual piece, but we need more empirical research to understand the unique challenges for employees with these kind of identities, because we cannot put the like a transgender single parent and an employee in a same-sex partner household in the same pedestal, or can say that they have the same challenges and therefore they should be provided the same kind of flexibility ideals. Because again, different for a transgender single parent, a gender reassignment surgery takes a long period of time, and that time child care is very difficult to manage. Similarly, with employees with same-sex partner households, their family structure may not be recognized by the neighbors or families, and therefore they may not be given that kind of a social support which they might need in order to overcome some of their family challenges. The second study points to shareholder value maximization, and that's where the future question arises. After the pandemic, when the companies start resuming their financial activities or start improving their financial performance, what will the shareholder decision making be like? Will diversity goals such as having more women on boards or women on top management teams be pushed behind because it's something not which is seen as a priority for shareholders? Or whether this diversity goals will be seen as something new and something more important after the pandemic? And lastly, finding more or new ways through which diversity can enhance firm value. So again, while firm financial performance or the business case of gender diversity has been studied so much, that there might be other ways in which diversity can actually enhance firm value. And that's where we need to look into different stakeholders like employees and customers, and how women on boards or women in top management teams can really bring value based on their different experiences and different perspectives compared to men or other identity groups. So that's it from my side, and thank you so much.
The previous presentations have addressed women, diversity and inclusion aspects. I will try to go deeper on the aspect of diversity in general and inequality in general, and how that manifests into other aspects like gender, race, etc., religion, etc. So this would be more about the ontological treatment to the concept rather than actually measuring it or how that is brought to the practice. I think previous speakers have given great insights into the statistics, how COVID has impacted in various ways. I just want to add that the fourth industrial revolution has already been researched upon, and its impact on the future. COVID-19 has fortunately or unfortunately accelerated those impacts. And these impacts have created inequalities of also in certain ways. Especially under VUCA environment, they have created certain problems also, problems at global, social, institutional, individual levels. And today we are talking about more the problems pertaining to the inequalities. And some of them are, of course, highlighted by the previous speakers. The researchers who are working on the fourth industrial revolution, from that view, they have also viewed the future, and they try to put together the risks that we are likely to face in the future. These are some of the risks. There are risks which are directly termed as part of inequality, like digital inequality. But if you see, if you have a closer look at the other problems, other risks, they also have some way or shape or form related to some or the other inequality. Like, for example, weapons of mass destruction. It's an inequality of power structure, which has a relationship with the nation's propensity towards aggregating weapons of mass destruction. So if you see, analyze, each of these things. So I see them as a tree, like an ancient approach of Ayurveda to treating a disease. not just going by the symptom or the leaf or the fruit of the tree to cure that, but rather going into the root. So I see inequality as one of the roots, which is actually giving rise to these kind of problems that we are facing at various levels. If you also pay attention to the UN SDGs, they are also reflective of a similar thing. But I would rather share this thought in open right now, because this is still open to some arguments. If you look at the UN SDG 1, it says no poverty. It doesn't say reduced poverty. It says no poverty. So poverty is a manifestation of inequality in terms of economic status, in a way. So that says no poverty. And in goal 10, it says reduced inequality. And it doesn't say no inequality. Then fifth is gender equality. Of course, it has been already talked about. So these are some of the thoughts that I would like to share. And by sharing these thoughts, let me a quick, introduction of my background, some background information. I spent 11 years in technology, working with technology firms in US, India, serving clients in other countries. Then subsequently 11 years I spent with management research, primarily into fundamental research in organization theories, especially into definitions. And there I went a little deeper into philosophy and theology and religion, which led me to the current coordinates. So next 11 years, of course, I will spend in theology and religion. So this background was important so that you could understand or maybe appreciate the thoughts where they are coming from. So let's revisit the definition again. The diversity is the range of human differences. So with regards to race, ethnicity, gender, etc. So the key word is range of human differences. And we know that human differences are not going to go away. And this is not, is it really intentional? Do we want human differences to go away? Or do we want to really celebrate those differences? So that's the fundamental view on diversity that one has to really introspect, reflect upon. Second definition is the definition of inclusion. Inclusion is involvement / empowerment where the inherent worth and dignity of all people are recognized. So the key word is inherent worth and dignity. If we look at the definition of spirituality, it's not very far from this phrase inherent worth and dignity. It's just that in spirituality, we try to connect back to ourselves. We try to connect to our our self, the concept of self, and we try to enlarge it and in a way that it connects to the other parts of the universe. And if we see this, if we institutionalize this, it's called religion, where there are traditions, where there are rituals, etc. In an organizational setup, we do have policies, we do have rituals. So it is it's in a way it's religiosity in work. And now this religiosity needs some spiritual base. And this is where I'm drawing analogy. So let's examine now the three things, the current state, what's the goal, and our responsibility. While doing that, I'm bringing the framework of yoga, one of the frameworks from yoga. In yoga, there are various approaches given. One of the approaches that is given to look at the problem is there is a problem and there is a root cause and there is an ideal state, and you try to attain that ideal state. So it is different than the approach that we look at the problem, we try to solve it. Past decades, researchers have first identified the problems. It's a great work. So we are not living in the state of denial that the problem exists. Second, researchers again started to piece together the causality behind those things, which can help us actually put together a tree where we could really now see that lack of inherent worth and dignity seems to be a root cause of majority of problems that are stemming out of inequality in general. This problem got compounded because of three reasons. One, the over-connected world. under postmodernist influence. And since time is less, I will not go into the details of the these philosophies. But due to overconnected, the information on the worldview, which is of a different context, gets transported to a worldview of a different context, thus creating an artificial inequality or an inequality which was not really there at the first place or was not being experienced. I would compare this impact with the thing called metastasis. Metastasis is, we all know that death because of cancer happens due to metastasis. When there are cancerous cells which were quietly sitting at the location of cancer, but when after some time they start traveling to various parts in the body and they hit the vital centers and they cause death. So this is a similar situation where we try to transport philosophies from one worldview to the other worldview, other context where they may not match. Like the status of women in different ways. Every country, culture, religion, they have a different view of women and different view of society levels, etc. Second, largely instrumental or myopic symptomatic approaches, which led to something which I'm comparing it with iatrogenesis. Iatrogenesis is a term from medicine. I'm taking from again medicine, where we do something and we screw up something else. So side effects of the medicines are studied in this field. So we created ways to address diversity through mandatory inclusion at times, which may be contextually relevant for certain cases, but may not be. But one shoe fits all approaches in a homogenized way may have created newer forms of inequalities. And then, of course, I've discussed the fourth industrial revolution, the COVID accelerated thing. The technologies also created new forms of inequalities. The third thing is trashing even the conducive or the healthy aspects of religiosity and spiritual traditions. It's like throwing the baby with the bathwater. We've been. It's not that we have started living in last few decades, or humanity has been around for thousands of years. So there must be some secret sauce of living together. And if we really pay attention, that even in a community there are hundreds of inequalities. If you call it inequalities, there are diverse ways of expressions. And there has always been the clash of civilizations, clash of worldviews, and they figured out a way of living together. And we have many examples of history of doing it correctly or not doing it correctly also, of course. But trashing the whole is not helping either. So if you look at the future, if we really have to set our goal, then what are our choices? If we go on the extrinsic or the instrumental aspect of it, or do we want to go the intrinsic way? So three approaches are possible. One way is that you create a way which is implemented all across the place, one way, or whoever doesn't agree, you show them the highway. But that fundamentally will be contradictory to the philosophy of diversity and inclusion itself. Second way is the synthetic way. It's like whoever makes the highest noise, you give them the proportion of the voice on the board. It's like putting together a board where you are just balancing the power with regards to newer categories of diversity, in terms of gender or in terms of regional, or in terms of maybe ethnicity, etc. Or an integrative way. So this is integrative is something that we are researching on for last 10, 11 years. So this is something that we think it's the ideal state that we could be. And what are the ways to achieve it? I just leave you with these two thoughts, that it's about awareness of multi-paradigmatic thinking and multiplicity of worldviews together. Earlier it was a luxury, but now it's a need. Second is imagining ways to effectively engage diversity rather than we have to. It's like diversity as something to deliver. So that is imagining ways to how we can engage diversity, and that may structurally solve a lot of problems that we are having. I think these are the thoughts that I wanted to share.
Aiming at researchers community. And when I say researchers community, possibly the very first thing is that how exactly we understand inclusion. So my presentation is a mixture of some of the past work and definitions for the researchers community especially. And but more than that, as Anshu introduced, I am into Buddhist philosophy and psychology, little bit of that. I am also a beginner and learner there because the subject is very, very deep. So what is inclusion? Already the introduction has been there, by Professor Puneet Bindlish. And as I said, something it is specifically in terms of workplaces, when we're working together with very different people, very different environment they come from, how much we can negotiate and navigate our unconscious bias. In addition to that, there are a lot of ways, lot of lenses of looking at inclusion. And inclusion is also, one of the things, which I caught my attention is the extent to which employees believe their organization engage in efforts to involve all employees, very different, but all employees in the mission and operation of the organization. And important words are with respect to their individual talents. Of course, dignity is something Professor Puneet talked about. Equity, diversity, inclusion, equal opportunity are, some things where the, focus is. Now coming back to the researchers focus, the thought, I started having when I started writing down this presentation, that what it is about. Inclusion. Is inclusion something like we can treat as very in an instrumental way, or actually it is it is cognitive development process? I think inclusion has to do everything with the awareness and awareness of awareness, two levels, deeper levels. And inclusion has to do something with the knowing, because that knowing shapes us. If I have to write very simply, I say mind over matter. Another interesting thing during my retreat I picked up is anything outside, and I'm coming from mind's only school of Buddhist philosophy, Mahayana. Anything outside is not knowing. Mind's only says that only the mind, mind is limited to the knowing of the mind, and everything, so there are two schools, but the mind's only school says that outside is not knowing. And then there is another Prasangika which says that inside and outside all are empty, which is the Shunyata, the philosophy of emptiness. Now, interesting it is, then inner knowing is not individual property, it is collective in nature, because it is formed with the interaction with the others and nature. Knowledge, therefore, which we accumulate can only be subjective. It is not an objective in connotation, in conceptual understanding. To quote S. Radhakrishnan, who's translated Gita in a very beautiful common reading form, though still I find it difficult, and a brilliant philosopher, scholar who was president of India also, an inner knowledge cannot be comprehended as an object of knowledge. So what do we do with the knowledge then? And knowledge is something we actually collect during the research. So is knowledge process and outcome is another question. So I decided, just to have a minute or two to have this inquiry into the theory of knowledge from the Buddhist perspective. There are a lot of epistemic formulations in India, and we have a lot of diversity there too. Now, theory of knowledge from the Buddhist perspective. So the whole narrative is about enlightenment, which is nothing but, inside out to be empty, like an empty pot. And three concepts which possibly in a very simple way I could put before the future researchers is three things: Sheel, Samadhi, and Pragya. Sheel is the moral conduct, right way of approaching. Ethics, in a way, you can say. Right way of looking at the thing, and that right itself has a lot of connotation. Then Samadhi, indestructible concentration, involving a movement from intense intellect. Meditation usually is supposed to be a way for that, but there are many ways by which it can happen. And Pragya. Pragya, through karuna, compassion, utmost compassion, to Gyan, knowledge, actually is the highest wisdom-based knowledge. So attained through three ways: hearing, listening, contemplation, and meditation. Possibly the idea of knowledge is more of a process than an end product. And once it is clear, possibly the researchers would know how to approach it. Now, process of creating knowledge from intense intellect, a process of transformation from pragya to gyan, from wisdom to knowledge, I think is the journey of research in a subject like inclusion and inclusive organization. We cannot treat it, we can, let's be diverse, but this will be possibly more justice to the subject, because subject is of emotional importance, historical importance, legal in connotation, and it is to do with the mind and the emotions, both the intellect and the emotive aspects we have, qualities we have. So inclusive workplace. I just looked at, the past researchers, and I thought, for the researchers community, possibly I can just pick up one or two things. And just to, summarize it very quickly, workplaces, and I'm going to read just the first one. Workplaces are in many ways microcosm of a nation. And it represents multiple kinds of people based on race, gender, ethnicity, culture, religion, sexual orientation, all under one banner, working towards the same goal, because organizations are bounded reality and they exist for some certain goals. So possibly in that case, with the kind of demographic diversities we have, global or local in India, because of MNCs and even the local ethnic organization, diversity of thought is seen as the end game, which was quoted. I have all the references here earlier also. Then agility, resilience, vulnerability, I think are the other aspects. Coming back to the workplace inclusion. Workplace inclusion, again, it is an attempt where, despite the differences in needs, perceptions, as well as focus on creating structures, systems, processes, can it feel everybody valued and treated equitably, and as Puneet added, with dignity and respect. Now, drivers of inclusion have been studied. I am just, digging out something from the past researches. So merit-based practices, policies, senior leader behavior, managerial behavior, work-life balances, and possibly the another level of study with the work-life balance being the outdated concept when the 24 hours we are working, when work from home or work from remote working. Some of the outcomes also have been researched, like in terms of values, humility, acceptance of difference, openness of idea, flexibility, in terms of knowledge, awareness, self-awareness, then awareness of law and environment, and last but not the least is skills like listening, empathy, compassion, and I'm glad that they are coming to the all my subject performance management. So they're coming to 360 degree, as an important indicator. And the global companies are talking about the compassion and empathy at the workplace. Quickly, 3 agendas, and I will just quickly touch, subject to the time, so some main aspects. So the very first is future agenda. Now, if I have to talk of future agenda for this subject, I think I'll talk about research, researchers, knowledge, and knowing. Knowing and knowledge I have already touched. Research. is an empirical demand. For this subject, I think the justice can come from a very deep, innovative way of qualitatively capturing the information, or more than the information, the intent possibly. Researchers are the community of knowledge seekers. Knowledge knows no boundary. It is truly inclusive inherently. And that, gives us a hope that researchers can actually dig in from a very, minimum biased eyes. I cannot say no bias. There's no such stage. And something, from, some lines which caught my attention, I'm sharing with you. And the lines actually indicate the context where we come from in such researches, should come from or come from. That which is not thought by the mind, but by which the mind is thought. We impute mind, not seen by the eyes, but by which the eyes are seen. We impute eyes. Because eyes alone don't see. Eyes with the mind. Eye sense power consciousness with the mental consciousness actually gives us the vision. That which is not breathed by the life, but by which the life breathes. That is the essence of knowledge, and researchers need to be embedded in that mode to go to the, for information seeking and to create a body of knowledge for a very relevant future inclusive organization. I'll run through these 2 slides quickly and I'll send my presentation. It was again a digging of past researches, and references are there in the end. So a lot of work has happened in terms of themes for the future research, for the leadership style, culture, then sense of belongingness, and celebrating the uniqueness of individuals, so that then a common thread can be woven around that. Sustainable ventures actually are the inclusive or diversity-based interventions. Strategies to promote that, communication as a channel, gender diversity, we've already talked about, glass ceiling, leadership, women in board, we have already talked about today. Rural integration, I think, is very important, at least in Indian context, because rural-urban divide is huge, and exclusion of, with a particular group, especially the urban by rural, actually is a huge cause of loss of talent, at least in India. And there are similar cases all across the globe. Then quickly, so influencers and the factors, and then coming quickly to the ways of, one of the things I like to read here is ways of acknowledging and benefiting from an intrinsic ability as Indians in Indian context to live, interact, and prosper in a diverse community is actually, need to be investigated, because yet we are failing miserably. And I think it is a big truth for the globe. We have huge divide. Second agenda, caste discrimination, which has been in my mind, and possibly if I really focus a little more, that is something where I like to dwell in terms of discourse, discussion, documentation, and the ways of integration. So racial discrimination, so it is not India specific. My friend Avinash Kumar, director ex I would say Amnesty, because India closed the door on Amnesty International lately. So, he is writing a very beautiful paper, and I'm sharing a bit from there. So, he actually has come out with a global caste, information, I would say. So, for example, racial discrimination, how it can be defined from the International Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. I really thought, something he shared with me, any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying and impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise or an unequal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, culture, or any other public field of public life. If this is the definition of racial discriminations, we have many challenge to, to research, investigate, and come out with, what is possible in terms of inclusion. Then inherited discrimination. is again, that historically, you are born into some clan and community, and that is where, the segregation happens in the property, in the community, in the citizenship, and generalized lack of respect for the human dignity and equality because of the historical embeddedness. I think, when Jennifer talked about, if I remember right, the black slavery, then possibly, and a hint of that I got in the first presentation also in Australian context. Africa. This is from the working paper as written here. There are a lot of, discrimination present in terms of West Africa, East Africa, and again, the slavery, which is historical. Slave once becomes slave later. And all documentation is very much available, and a lot of communication is happening globally. UN is facilitated, and I'm so glad about it. Affected communities. You can see the whole list here. And I am sure, there are many more which possibly have escaped documentation because of a lot of still tribal communities not really being open to us. I know from India, and I'm sure it is truth of Africa also. So heredity, endogamous groups that are assigned specific occupations and governed by strict hierarchical relationships, purity and pollution are the reason. And who will know it better than a very typical Indian who would know that there were 4 levels, and finally it got merged in the modern India into 2 levels, upper caste, lower caste. But the way there is a segregation is something which is absolutely inhuman, is something I would say in any forum. Because born, we all are same, but we are too embedded in a cultural heritage which possibly needs to be questioned. Then Asia, Japan case, I just want to talk here. And Burra Cumin case, as you can read in the slide, this is shared by Avinash again, from the various sources he consulted for writing his paper, which he's submitting today, tomorrow. It's not published yet. Burra Cumin, what an interesting and sad and shocking, documentation it is, that they suddenly realized high caste Japanese in 1998, according to Buraku Civil Rights Group. They realized that and then over 700 companies were discovered to have hired private investigators to find out job applicants' Buraku origins, ethnic background, nationality, ideology, religion, and politics. And after factoring even the A-starers in terms of performance, were given the bad ranking, and they were advisable not to hire, was the tag given to them. So this is how the caste rules over us, despite we being in 2021. Now coming back to the Indian workforce challenge. Some data, and very basic data, there is too much data present. So quickly, percentage of share, you can have a look that we have buckets, and it's very 8% for ST, when 34% for general and 41% for OBC, which is the middle caste. Coming back to the unemployment rate, June 21, 12.66%, humongous drop from 5, it was 5%, then 2020, I think it was a 7 point something. And last but not the least, women dropping out from the employment, as Jennifer mentioned. I was so surprised to see from last year 30% to the, so almost 10% of the drop for the women. And I think a major reason is that in the rural Indian women, there was something called Manrega schemes by the government, and the funding has really been either reducing or stopped. So poor are getting poorer and hungrier and dying with COVID. COVID has not spared. COVID in some ways I find is strangely equal, because COVID has attacked young, old, now third wave they say child. But I wish we get more equal. Now coming back to the situation in India, total working population 130 million, 46% are the working, out of that 20% on women, 0.5% on differently abled. SC/ST, I was digging. Finally, I came across a group with whom possibly I like to work, which is advocacy group called DICI, Dalits in Chamber of Commerce. Challenges of inclusion, plentiful. Since I have 6 minutes left, possibly, I'll just run through this. Basically, all the background I have given provide the challenges and deep-rooted stereotypes, historical legacy in terms of segregation, and thought and the knowledge, exclusion, I think the basic concern. And of course, then, it goes to the very mundane, I will not say mundane, but the organizational behavior level also and leadership. Difficulty in communication with different ethnic groups or different caste and class and languages. Languages are another big, difference globally and in India also. And it provides a lack of inclusion, and for very many reasons, from complexes to the technicalities. And then skewed gender mix we've already talked about. MNCs in India have done some good interventions. So for the researchers, possibly, they can dig. And the only thing is unconscious bias training. And since Anshu says we are running out of time, let me come out with some anecdotal example of ICICI Bank, Tata Group, very beautiful initiatives in terms of inclusive organization. And I'm closing by these 2 slides. Education needs a relook. What is the base for all that? Education, education, and education. The big reason for this underrepresentation is that education system is biased in Dalits, also women. Men are given priority in a patriarchy called India, and I think globally also it's skewed. Evidence of caste-based discrimination in Institute of Higher Learning is rampant, and the GNU professor has documented, many people have documented, and we have suicide of Rohit Vemula, which also was indicated at the level of complexity. Quickly, to go through it, restricted access to education, marginalized, entitled, also creates the lack of inclusion. Interviews as a selection technique is the biggest hurdle, where the language and the soft skills becomes a problem, says the CHRO of Apollo Tyres, who actually possibly is scouting for talent. In conclusion, my last slide here. In the book, one of my favorites is The Crisis Within by G.N. Devi, a scholar, and he's a linguist and knowledge and culture and colonizing and understanding and decolonizing efforts. I mean, he's done brilliant work there. Living legend, I would say, in south of India. So in 2017, according to his book, Crisis Within, nearly 1 in every 6 human beings are a young Indian for whom meaningful education is of critical importance. In addition to the employability, it will also lead to the widening of a collective imagination and shaping of the way we think. So an important concerns of our time for inclusive organization. So inclusion has to begin from the basic education, and possibly then organizations will also get mature enough to be inclusive. And last but not the least, if knowledge is the core of education, since I began, my discourse on knowledge, and if that is the very foundation of a nation, possibly we need to address it without delay, especially in the age of technology, where rapidly sinking fortunes of natural memory and knowledge effected through threefold exclusion: further linguistic, ethnic, and epistemic.